Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our webinar participants. My name is Thomas Krüger, and I'm Product Manager for the Babylock ventilators at the Drägerwerk headquarters in Germany. I would like to welcome you to our international webinar conducted by Professor Jane Pillow. Jane Pillow is Professor in Neonatology and Co-Director of the Center of Neonatal Research and Education at the University of Western Australia. Professor Pillow started her career with a Bachelor of Medical Science at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne. From there, she was active in different places in Queensland, Australia, and London in UK, with different research projects in the field of respiratory function, lung development, high-frequency ventilation, innate defense, and nebulized surfactant application. Over the last 20 years, she published more than 100 scientific papers, conference papers, book chapters, and review articles, spoke on multiple national and international meetings, and is one of the best-known and highly acknowledged scientists in the field of neonatal respiratory physiology and mechanical ventilation. Professor Pillow has extensive commitments to undergraduate, postgraduate, and clinical education through involvement in university course delivery and small group theoretical and practical workshops throughout Australia, Asia, and Europe. She's a member of the executive of the Australian and New Zealand Neonatal Network and chairs the ANZNN Working Group on Chronic Lung Disease. Furthermore, Professor Pillow is director of the Preclinical Intensive Care Research Unit, an international unique facility for extended duration care of preterm lambs as a model of lung disease associated with preterm birth. We are very happy that we can offer you today our international webinar with Jane Pillow on the topic of mandatory minute ventilation, short MMV. So now I would like to hand over to Professor Pillow for her presentation. So Jane, it's up to you.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and really a great pleasure to be here and giving this webinar for you all around the world, hopefully. And I trust that you're sitting back and enjoying a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, or for those of us who've already finished work for the day, perhaps sitting down with a glass of wine while you listen to the next little bit. So the purpose today, as you know, is to go over mandatory minute ventilation with Babylock VN500, and I'll be doing a number of different things, but giving you a little bit of background to start off with. So we're going to talk a bit about the definition, the basics of mandatory minute ventilation. How does it work? What are the key differences between this mode and other neonatal ventilatory modalities? And a little bit about the potential theoretical benefits of MMV. And then the middle section, I will really spend some time on the clinical application. How do you go about doing this? What are the indications for using MMV? How do you go about starting it? How do you go about continuing it and modifying how things are progressing? How do you adjust the different components, so the mandatory and the spontaneous ventilator settings in response to patient needs, and some additional considerations for weaning. And then we'll also do a little bit of troubleshooting at the end before I finish up. So I expect this to take about 45 to 50 minutes. Hopefully I won't get carried away with talking and speak for longer than that, and give us enough time to do a bit of questioning at the end. So what is MMV? Well, ultimately, this is an integrated sort of seamless form of ventilation. It promotes that development of patient-initiated breathing patterns while also guaranteeing a minimum level of minute ventilation. And this graphic down the bottom really typifies what MMV is all about, that you might start off with a situation where you have got sorry, I just haven't gone further. Forgot to advance my slide, so I'm just going to turn around here. Okay, so that you might start off where you have no spontaneous breathing and mandatory minute ventilation, is full and complete, and then the baby will start spontaneous breathing, and you get a mixture of spontaneously supported and mandatory volume, so that you are getting that set mandatory ventilation delivered as a minimum at all times. And then at some point in time where the baby develops sufficient spontaneous breathing, completely takes over the breathing, then the mandatory component backs off completely, and you're just getting spontaneous breaths being supported. So pressure supported synchronized breaths are a fundamental component of that, but these are supplemented all the time by pressure limited volume guarantee mandatory breaths that are delivered if the minute volume falls below the mandatory minute volume that you've set. So there's always this backup option available for you. So if we think about MMV and what is it closest to, fundamentally it's based on the principles of pressure-controlled, synchronized intermittent mandatory ventilation with volume guarantee plus pressure support. So let's break that down a bit and just start off thinking about SIMV with volume guarantee. And I think that many of you will be very used to this modality, where the minimum minute volume is determined by the volume guarantee and the set respiratory rate that you put onto the ventilator. So you've got that mandatory component, but the baby can breathe additionally to what you've set as the mandatory ventilator rate, but any of those additional spontaneous breaths are not supported. So that's not new to any of you, nor is the fact new to you that you are responsible as the clinician for adjusting the respiratory rate for any mandatory breaths. If you've got volume guarantee on, the ventilator will adjust your peak inspiratory pressure, but you have to manually adjust the respiratory rate if you want to alter that kind of minute volume that the baby is getting as a minimum throughout each minute. There are some traps in doing that though, and for example, if you set the respiratory rate too low, then your infant is quite vulnerable to becoming quite unstable from a cardiorespiratory perspective if, for example, they start developing the periodic breathing. So if you add to SIMV and volume guarantee, you now add pressure support, very similar to the SIMV volume guarantee, but now those additional spontaneous breaths are pressure supported and reduce the infant's work of breathing. So that pressure support is then constant for all of those spontaneous non-mandatory breaths unless you adjust it as the clinician. So how then does MMV with volume guarantee differ from SIMV with volume guarantee? Once again, you've got minimum minute ventilation being determined by the set tidal volume and the set respiratory rate, and the infant can take unsupported breaths between the mandatory breaths. So this is no different to SIMV plus volume guarantee. However, the additional benefit of MMV is that the ventilator will now adjust the mandatory ventilation rate automatically according to what the current minute volume is that the baby's achieving and what you've set as the mandatory minute volume. And in that adjustment, you get the infant is protected from instability created by suddenly them dropping their spontaneous respiratory rate. The ventilator will pick up and deliver additional breaths. Or likewise, if the baby picks up its respiratory rate and doesn't need so much support, the ventilator will be able to back off the breathing that it delivers. So as such, the unique advantage of MMV with volume guarantee and pressure support is that you really get the full range of ventilator support provided. You're getting the baby who's very passive with no respiratory drive is receiving the equivalent of pressure-controlled SIMV with volume guarantee. But the baby who's breathing very, very actively, the one who's got that really strong respiratory drive, may be ventilated only with pressure support. And then you can get all manner of combinations between there. So this graphic down below here, you can see an infant that's breathing with a combination of some mandatory breaths, and then the baby's kicking in with its own breaths, and then the mandatory breaths may continue again at a later point. So the pressure support, again, that's being delivered here is constant for all spontaneous breaths. So this is really where your clinical skill comes in, because if the spontaneous tidal volume is too high or too low and therefore compromising the physiologic stability of the infant, you need to adjust the pressure support that's given. But it's really not that difficult to do that, and we're going to go through some examples a little bit later about how that's achieved. So I guess when we think about the difference between how MMV relates to other ventilatory modalities, we've got a gradation or a spectrum of options or benefits that are offered by different modes. And if we go right back to the very basic intermittent mandatory ventilation, you get no inspiratory trigger, so no synchronized breaths. You're not getting spontaneous breaths assisted. You've got very fixed respiratory rate, fixed inspiratory time, no differential support of the mandatory and spontaneous breaths, and you don't really have a guaranteed minute ventilation, because if the baby suddenly goes into an apnea and you had your rates set relatively low, for example, the baby would become quite hypopneic as a result of that. And if you take it to the other extreme, MMV is on the right-hand side of this table because it does offer synchronized breaths. Every breath is assisted, although differentially. Ventilator-assisted respiratory rate is variable. The inspiratory time has got a fixed component for the mandatory breaths, a variable component for pressure support. The mandatory and spontaneous breaths can be different volumes, but you've also got this guaranteed minute ventilation, which has that seamless kind of apnea support. So all up, you have got a change in severity as you go across that table, not severity, but degree of flexibility and variability in the support that's provided and options for the infant to develop normal physiological rhythms. So what are the theoretical benefits then of MMV with pressure support? And probably first and most of those, and we've mentioned it already, is the automated weaning of mandatory respiratory rate and peak inspiratory pressure. So if we look at this, and actually there is not terribly much literature on this, and it's surprising because MMV has actually been around for a while. This is an article back from 1989, so over 30 years ago now, a small adult randomized controlled trial where they had 40 adults and they randomized them to either get IMV or MMV. And you can see the infants who got adults who got MMV actually were weaned off the ventilator in a very, very short period of time, compared to those that were on IMV and who were dependent on the clinician to make the decision about when they were ready to extubate. And I think that this, in many respects, reflects how busy we are in the intensive care, and all of you will be very familiar with that. If you've got a very big unit and babies arriving from right, left and centre, it's quite difficult to simultaneously be looking after all of those babies at the same time and be making the appropriate decisions in real time for those babies. So speeding up those decision-making with the automated support is a huge benefit. But it's not only in adults. This is an article from about 15 years ago from Guthrie and colleagues. Now, they looked at newborns, late preterms to term babies. Relatively small study, only 20 infants. The volume guarantee they set at 4 to 6 mils per kilo, and it was a cross-hour over study. So each infant spent 2 hours in SIMV or MMV or vice versa, and then crossed over to the alternate modality. And one of the things they did as part of that is look at the number of breaths that they took and whether they were mandated breaths or spontaneous breaths. And you can see that these reasonably well infants were getting approximately 50% of their breathing was spontaneous breathing, but 50% was mandated when they were on SIMV. But changing them to MMV allowed those infants to totally take over and breathe as much as they wanted to with very little mandatory component. And the consequence of this is that the same minute volume and the same CO2 control was achieved with both modalities, but MMV did this with fewer mandatory breaths. And as a consequence, probably also slightly lower mean airway pressure because these mandatory breaths tend to be slightly larger breaths needing a higher peak inspiratory pressure. So seamless apnea ventilation, reducing intermittent hypoxia is an important part of MMV. So the infant on MMV can have start and finish their breathing whenever they want, but if they do develop periodic breathing, apnea, hypopnea, then MMV will kick in. So if we have a look at this diagram down the bottom left, for example, it's an infant, I've just caught the end of its spontaneous breathing here, and then it's had this sort of breathing interruption, and then the mandatory breath has kicked in. Now, it's kicked in probably because the infant prior to this time was actually a little bit hypopneic anyway. So its minute volume was dropping, and then with this interruption in its breathing pattern, the minute volume fell below what was set as the mandatory minute volume for that infant, and so the ventilator kicked in with a breath. However, you could also have a situation where the baby is breathing very regularly with a minute volume well above the mandated minute volume and then develops an apnea. And in that situation, it can take quite a while for the minute volume to fall below that level that you've set as the mandatory minute volume. So the ventilator then has this built-in safety mechanism where it only allows a maximum amount of time to elapse before it will actually kick in with a breath, so that there's always a maximum time that will elapse, and it may kick in with a breath before the minute volume has actually dropped below if that time has elapsed. So how does this change? I said this is more stable arterial blood gases. This is probably an example of this. And again, the literature is limited, but this article from Clare and colleagues in 2009 probably is a reasonable example of that. Now, they used, wasn't a Draeger MMV, but something similar. They had SIMV, they had a modality with a volume guarantee targeted tidal volume. And then they had a modality with a targeted minute volume, and then combined targeted minute volume with volume targeting. So this would be MMV with volume guarantee, but not with the additional pressure support. But if we have a look at what happened, they then looked at what happened to PaO2 and CO2 as the baby developed some apnea. Actually, this was in rabbits. So as an apnea was induced in the rabbits, what happened to the PaO2 and the CO2? And you can see that both of the targeted minute volume modalities had a significantly reduced fluctuation in PaO2 compared to that was achieved with SIMV alone or with even the volume guarantee. So that was important. But then as you develop these hypopneas, other things can happen in the lung. And one of the things that can happen if that's repeated is that you can develop low lung volumes, low FRC, and impaired compliance. And in that situation, the MMV that included also the volume guarantee was significantly different to SIMV alone, but also to the other two modalities, so both targeted tidal volume or volume guarantee and the targeted minute volume alone without a maintained or targeted tidal volume. So it's the combination of that minute volume and maintaining tidal volumes at volumes which allows the peak inspiratory pressure to change if the compliance is changing, that allows that oxygenation to stay stable, but also importantly stabilizes the carbon dioxide. So we have much less fluctuation in our blood gases, and that change in carbon dioxide might also be important, for example, for cerebral blood flow stability and trying to prevent neurological damage in the infants that we're treating. Okay, so we saw this diagram before in terms of the active support of spontaneous breathing, and that MMV encourages this spontaneous support. And why is that in particular important? And one of the the things that we want to do when we start ventilating a baby is we want to be able to extubate. That's something that should be right in the forefront of our mind from the very point that we start mechanically ventilating, is how am I going to get this baby off the ventilator? And we know from adult medicine that it is really vital for us to preserve diaphragmatic function and to avoid development of ventilator-induced diaphragmatic dysfunction, or VIDD. So this is simply very similar to, say, having a cast on your arm or your leg for 6 weeks because you break a bone, and then having that cast removed and suddenly discovering that all your muscles have atrophied and wasted, and that actually you're not as strong as you were before. So the diaphragm is also a skeletal muscle. It's a very specialized skeletal muscle, but this atrophy happens incredibly quickly in the diaphragm, much faster than even in the other normal locomotive skeletal muscles in the body. So what we don't want to do is have prolonged periods of babies not breathing spontaneously, because we know that will impair their diaphragm. And I think clinically, you can probably all think of a situation where you've had a baby on a ventilator, and I know this happened to me many times, where you're on very, very minimal settings. The baby's got perfect gases. It seems to really not require very much support. You think, I'll be able to extubate this baby. It'll be an absolute breeze. You take the tube out and the baby falls at an absolute heap. And more often than not, the reason that baby has fallen in an absolute heap is because they simply are not able to overcome the impedance of their chest and to breathe, because their diaphragms are too weak to do so. So trying to maintain this diaphragm function and contractility is really, really important. And as a consequence of that, MMV is really training that progressive independent training of the respiratory muscles, which will allow them to support themselves once they're breathing spontaneously. And that's really an integral part of spontaneous breathing, and obviously therefore successful weaning and extubation. So another important part about helping to stabilize blood gases is actually maintaining lung volume. And we saw earlier how if lung volume is impaired, that any apneic events can have exaggerated impact on blood gases. So we want to try and maintain lung volume and compliance as normally as we can. One of the things that is quite important for that is having variable breath sizes. So we know this is a very physiological mechanism, and usually the way that we maintain our own lung volume is to have a sigh. So you and I will probably have a sigh, big, long, deep breath, and we might do that about once an hour. We would normally do it completely unconsciously and not aware of what we're doing. Maybe you're doing it now. If I'm really boring, you're probably doing it a lot. But this is something that is a very physiologic mechanism that we do innately in order to maintain our lung volume and stop it collapsing. Now, term babies will do that more often than adults, and term babies might do that every 2 or 3 minutes. But a preterm baby, if you monitor them, will often sigh about every 30 seconds or so. So this is an incredibly important mechanism for premature babies, for them to maintain their lung volume. And that variable tidal volume, variable respiratory rate, we know is an important part of that. They have a very sort of a jagged process where they take a breath, they increase their lung volume, it gradually falls down, and then right before a sigh, it's quite low, and they take a breath and it increases again. So this is something that we need to be able to preserve, really, if we're trying to prevent our babies from developing that atelectasis that we all know ends up in this series of problems and complications that can make things very difficult for us. So we know that biological variability and keeping that in respiratory rhythms, both in the volume as well as the rhythm of the baby's breathing, is really important. And this is where I think MMV again comes in, because that automatic variation of that mandated breathing during MMV and the ability for the infant to control its own spontaneous respiratory rate means that you get patient control over their breathing patterns and more normal patterns emerging. And this is really quite a departure from certainly the teaching I had when I was first learning neonatology, where it was that the clinician really had to control the ventilation, that we had to have rates of 60 per minute so that we could control the baby and stop the baby doing its own thing. And I think that certainly learned in the laboratory over time that that's not necessarily the best way to go. So other evidence that we've been able to accumulate over the years, and I don't have time to show this all to you now, but we know that that biological variability helps to recruit volume, it helps to avoid the atelectasis. You get much more homogeneous distribution of air going in and out of the lung, you get better compliance, improved oxygenation, and that results in lower FiO2 requirements. But interesting, it also results in lower inflammatory responses and increasing surfactant synthesis and secretion by the baby itself. So all of those things are important if we're trying to get our babies to improve. Okay, so let's move on then to how do we actually do this, because that's all the theory and, you know, we really need to gain more evidence of this in neonatal populations now. But how do we do it, and how do we do it safely? Because this is fundamental if we're going to go ahead and start doing clinical trials, is that people actually understand this modality and how to deliver it in order to get the best benefit of it for the infant and to achieve the rapid weaning that we're desiring. So let's have a look. Firstly, what are the indications? Well, the indications are quite broad. So you can use this modality right from start, infants requiring full level of mechanical support, all the way through to the infant who is ready for extubation. It's useful in the baby who's got inefficient or quite variable spontaneous ventilation because they've got an unstable respiratory wave. This is a modality that can support that baby, encourage them to breathe spontaneously, but be ready to kick in and give them backup when they need it. It's also a useful modality to ascertain readiness to wean from mechanical ventilation. If you haven't been using it and then you use it and see a baby on 100% spontaneous ventilation with appropriate respiratory patterns, it's a pretty good indicator that your baby is ready to extubate. And then also for the seamless weaning of the infants from ventilation. Right, so how do we then go about setting it up? Well, this is just showing you some slides from the VN500 here. Going into our ventilation settings, you'll want to have a tab with pressure-controlled mandatory minute ventilation, and then you've got all the controls that you're normally familiar with SIMV, your respiratory rate, your tidal volume, which together are going to determine your MMV, so we'll go through that. FiO2, inspiratory time, maximum pressure for your volume guarantee, your PEEP, and then the slope, so how rapidly you get to that peak pressure, and the pressure support, which is the pressure given on top of the PEEP to support spontaneous breaths. So highlighting that, setting your MV, and setting the other factors. And then you can also go to the additional settings. Now, when you go into additional settings, you'll notice that volume guarantee is grayed out, and that is because volume guarantee is automatic. It's part of MMV. It's delivered with a volume guarantee in the VN500, so you don't need to enable it. You do still need to set the Pmax on the main ventilator settings screen. You might want to consider enabling automatic tube compensation to reduce the work of breathing through the tracheal tube for your infant. That will assist and enable the spontaneous breathing, and that's reasonably straightforward to do. You don't need to enable apnea ventilation as you might do in SIMV with very low set rates, because MMV offers that seamless apnea ventilation. It will increase or decrease the rate as required in order to overcome any temporary pauses in breathing. So mandatory minute ventilation is the set tidal volume times the set respiratory rate. So the very, very first step in this is to set the volume guarantee. And that's the breath size that you want to be delivered for any mandatory breaths. Now, what I would very strongly suggest you do here is to use a volume guarantee at the upper end of the desired tidal volume range. And that's because in this modality, we should be thinking about these mandatory breaths as recruitment breaths. They're not necessarily being delivered that often, but we want them when they are delivered to effectively be like mini size, to be recruiting lung volume and preventing the lung from collapsing. From there, once I've worked out what the volume guarantee is and set it, I would then look at the minimum mandatory volume, and I'd be thinking about what's the disease condition and the gestation, because that's going to influence my selection. And I'd be looking at what will achieve a permissive hypercapnia of 40 to 50 millimeters of mercury. Now, there may be some instances when you go for a slightly lower PA CO2 target, but this is when I'm looking at minimum MV, I'm not trying to achieve normocapnia. The baby may well do that itself with its additional spontaneous ventilation. But what I'm trying to set is a minimum level that will keep the baby stable without taking over the infant's own respiratory drive. And that's why we would go for a permissive hypercapnia with our setting there. So once I've got that, we'll set then the set respiratory rate to reach that minimum volume. Selecting the desired inspiratory time, so you're going to look at the flow waveform to do that. Select your slope. I would normally aim for about 50% of the set inspiratory time, and that's because it allows a gentle increase in pressure without really ripping the lung open, but still allows enough time for the full tidal volume to be delivered without artificially increasing the peak inspiratory pressure. And then I'll determine the maximum Pmax to achieve that tidal volume for the mandated breaths. And usually this I'd set 4 to 5 centimeters above the average working pressure during mandatory ventilation. And I'll look at my trend screens to look at that. If you set it too high, and I know that some units do this because the alarms annoy them, low tidal volume alarms, but you are setting yourself up for a disaster because your baby then can deteriorate a lot before the low tidal volume is triggered, and you're behind the 8 ball from the start. So 4 to 5 centimeters, I think, is a good kind of limit. You can always adjust it if you need to, but it's a good place to start. It's important that you set that from the mandatory ventilation working pressure, not from the working pressure during spontaneous ventilation, because that value during spontaneous ventilation may be insufficient to allow the kind of recruitment tidal volumes that you want during a mandatory ventilation where you've got periodic breathing. It's also important to remember that there's no one size fits all during any ventilation, because your ventilator requirements are influenced by a bunch of things, including your gestation, which alters your volume capacity in the lung, the underlying disease such as RDS, chronic lung disease, and natural disease history. But having said that, I've given some example combinations of settings below, and this is in the MMV booklet if you've managed to get your hands on a copy of that yet from Draeger representative. But it really is addressing a couple of issues. So preterm infants, for example, will require higher minute volume than term infants because they have smaller tidal volumes and increased dead space to tidal volume ratio. Preterm babies with chronic lung disease might require even higher minute volumes than babies with RDS, again, because of increased dead space. So if you're chronic lung disease baby and needing support with a higher positive end expiratory pressure, for example, you might need to be splinting those airways open because they tend to collapse. Then that will sort of accommodate more tidal volume and create a bigger dead space. So your overall minute volume needs to be higher. So term baby, 200 to 250 mils per kilo per minute. RDS, you might need to go a bit higher. RDS with a very small baby, very low birth weight, or very preterm, extremely preterm baby, even higher still as far as your target minute volume, and chronic lung disease, perhaps even at a higher level than that. Looking at your set tidal volume, remember I said these were on the higher end of what you would normally achieve, your set respiratory rate, and what we're looking for here is what's physiologically appropriate for that particular infant. So a very tiny infant should be breathing physiologically faster than the term infant because they've got smaller tidal volumes. But the more mature infant, the chronic lung disease, the term infant should be breathing reasonably slowly. So thinking about what is physiological for the infant that I'm treating is really important. Looking at the inspiratory time, and it will depend on the disease and where you are in the disease time course about what that inspiratory time might be. Chronic lung disease, for example, you might have quite a long set inspiratory time because you've got a very long time constant, whereas you tend to get shorter time constants in RDS. And then the slope we talked about being 50% of the time to achieve that inspiratory time. Okay, so let's take a specific example just to lead you through this. Let's say we've got a 1.5 kilo infant. It's got RDS. It's probably sitting in this range here, moderately preterm or later, slightly more mature, very preterm infant. So 1.5 kilo infant, we want to say get a tidal volume of 5.5 mils per kilo for the mandatory breath. So we can calculate from that our set tidal volume probably needs to be about 8.2, 8.3 mils, and we can set that on our ventilator. The next step is saying, what is the minute volume that we're targeting for permissive hypercapnia? So for this infant, we're saying probably around about 250 mils per kilo per minute. And then we can use those two values to calculate the set respiratory rate to achieve our target minute volume. So the target respiratory rate is going to be the desired minute volume, 250 mils per kilo per minute, divided by our 5.5 mils per kilo for the mandatory breath, which gives us a value of 45 breaths for this baby as its set respiratory rate. And you can see that falls approximately within the range that I've given there. Once you've set that mandatory component, you do need to go on and consider the pressure support for the spontaneous breaths. And this is the additional pressure superimposed on PEEP during a spontaneous breath that is going to be used to support the work of breathing of that baby for those spontaneous breaths. So normally what I would do is I'd set that and be monitoring the spontaneous tidal volume and increase my delta P sup until my spontaneous tidal volume is about 80% of the set tidal volume that I've got set on my mandatory ventilation. Remembering that this is targeting that kind of mini recruitment breath, but we actually want the baby to be breathing with a tidal volume slightly less than that, which it will achieve from its spontaneous breathing pattern. You do need to remember that this is not an automated component of this modality, and the requirements for that pressure support will change as you get your lung mechanics changing, your patient effort changing. So as the condition improves, you should be weaning the pressure support down, but it does need continuous review, because if your baby develops some secretions or an infection in its lung and suddenly starts to deteriorate, it's possible that baby's going to need more support as its impedance increases, and therefore its work of breathing for each breath will increase unless you overcome that with additional pressure support. How do you judge when you get that right? We're going to go through this in a minute, but the important thing to remember is you should always be looking at what is my respiratory rate and tidal volume that I'm getting for the spontaneous breaths, and how do they compare to the set values, and that will give you quite a good indication of the adequacy of the delta P support. So your respiratory rate is probably slightly higher than your set, and your spontaneous tidal volume should be slightly lower than your set if you have set these appropriately. It's not just about setting what's delivering, it's also about setting your alarm limits, because these are your safety valves. And this is really what you're using to alert yourself to a change in your baby's condition so that you can intervene early before those changes or altered condition becomes a problematic one for you to deal with. That might get into some kind of cyclic, never-ending circle that ends up with quite rapid acceleration of your ventilation. So setting your alarm limits, I think, is really important. And for this, you need to be thinking about what is your minimum minute volume. You've set it to 50, and you would calculate that out for a 1.5 kilo infant, and then set your high minute volume alarm around about twice what that is. So that's sufficiently high that you're going to be alerted if the baby is really breathing really quickly without having the alarm going off constantly and being and creating a lot of noise in the unit. Similarly, you want to set a low tidal volume alarm, and this will really just pick up the prolonged hypopnea or apnea that the baby may have. But, this could be, for example, a baby who's developing an infection, septic, and really losing their respiratory drive. And in that situation, it could be that then going into a period of more prolonged requirement for mandatory support, and you may have to increase your mandatory settings in order to set that support that baby through that difficult period. I set my apnea time to 15 to 20 seconds, safe, but you don't get any constant alarms. But then I also set alarms for respiratory rate, because remembering we're focusing on trying to reach or attain physiological breathing patterns for our babies, because physiological patterns will be the best as far as achieving ventilation without chewing up calories and oxygen consumption that otherwise might make our babies more unwell. So a high respiratory rate alarm, again, set about 200% above what it was, so 90 breaths per minute. But if your baby is breathing at 90 breaths continuously, this might be problematic. So it could be that you need to go a little bit lower than that. How much lower you go is really a balance you have to achieve for each infant, because you don't want to go so low that you're getting a high respiratory rate alarm going the whole time. Similarly, low respiratory rate alarm is really just picking up that baby who's really losing all respiratory drive, and I'd be normally setting at about 20 breaths or so below my target respiratory rate, just so I can pick up a baby who's got that prolonged apneic episode. The other important part about monitoring, I think, is having the right screen up in front of you, because having information at your fingertips and understanding what's happening to the baby, particularly over time, I think are a critical part of getting ventilation right. So rather than having knee-jerk reactions to something you see in an instant, is really appreciating what's happening to the baby over time. So making sure your screens are configured to allow that is really important, and making sure you're using the other information available to you, like your extended trends and tables, whenever you're adjusting ventilation, so that you are doing it based on a dynamic process rather than what's happening in the instant. So this is just an example of how I like to set my screen up for MMV. Yes, there is a lot of information there, but you get very used to looking at it. And the thing that I like in particular is the ability to include my trends, 30-minute trends. So rather than having to go into trends and data to see that information, I can see very quickly at a glance as I walk past the bed what's been happening over the last 30 minutes with this baby. And you can see that I had a period of just breathing with the ventilator only, and then it woke up and actually was assuming 100% control of its breathing, but only for short periods of time, and otherwise was halfway in between. You can see how appropriate your respiratory rate is over time. Rather than just looking at this value now, I can see that actually this baby had some very high respiratory rates at one point, and what was happening there you might want to know. I like to have the tidal volume per kilo up there as well, because it's a very quick kind of mental adjustment for me. Without having to know the baby's weight, the ventilator's already calculating for this for me, rather than having to convert this to a tidal volume per kilo. I also often will display both the spontaneous and the mandated values for different parameters, because again, this helps me assess as I'm going past the baby, have I got the spontaneous support for this baby set at the right level compared to the mandated levels? And are we achieving that kind of physiological target that we want with their breathing pattern? So the next question really is, how much minute volume is just right? And this is the Goldilocks question. I think, you know, you could have too much, not too little. You want it really just right in the middle. And part of that is really trying to understand what you're trying to achieve. So setting the mandatory volume, minute volume too low, you'll get the cardiorespiratory instability, hypercapnia. You might get muscle fatigue because the baby is trying to breathe really hard to overcome the fact that it's not getting enough minute volume from the mandatory support. That will drive oxygen consumption, but and will also increase work of breathing. So the baby is consuming a lot of calories for breathing and not growing, which is not what you want. Conversely, if you set it too high, you're going to depress the respiratory drive, you unload the respiratory muscles so they start getting atrophy, and then they're not much use to you when you want to wean that infant. And there are very limited opportunities then for spontaneous breathing if the infant's unable to meet the mandatory minute volume with the pressure support that you've provided. So this diagram is one that I like to think of as far as how do you adjust MV settings. And let's look first at how you might do it for a baby who's just receiving 100% mandatory ventilation with MMV. So this green area here will be the combinations of tidal volumes and respiratory rates that achieve a normocapnia. So permissive hypercapnia would be on the bottom end of this. If you get right down into this range, you're going to get quite markedly hypercapnic, and if you get very high tidal volumes, very high respiratory rates up in the top right corner, then you're going to be markedly hypocapnic. So if you're thinking about this, you want to be permissive hypercapnic, but you want to be achieving that with a physiological tidal volume and a physiological respiratory rate, because this is where your baby's going to consume the least amount of oxygen. They're going to be able to divert calories to growth rather than to the act of breathing. A tidal volume and respiratory rate that you're setting in order to get your baby in the sweet spot here. And that normal gases doesn't necessarily mean that you're being ventilated appropriately, because you could have a very high tidal volume, low respiratory rate and get a normal gas because you've got the minute volume the same as here, given that minute volume is what's adjusting your CO2 removal. All right, let's move from here to the baby who is trying to, now I'm trying to get onto spontaneous ventilation. There we go. What do you do when the baby's breathing 100% spontaneously and not getting any minute volume from the mandatory breaths at all? And this is very, very similar principles that you're adjusting. You need to be thinking where you are on this curve. So your sweet spot is sitting at this point here, and you need to be thinking, what is the spontaneous tidal volume? What is the spontaneous respiratory rate? And where do they sit in relation to your set respiratory rate and set tidal volume? Because really what you want to be doing is delivering spontaneous tidal volumes a bit below your set and respiratory rates that are probably a little bit higher than what your set rate is in order to get your spontaneous support around about right. And that's presuming you've set these correctly in the first place. All right, let's just quickly move on to troubleshooting, and then hopefully we'll have some time left for questions, and I apologize about the delay. Let's think about some of the problems that happen. So one of them is that your baby is not doing any spontaneous breathing at all, and you have to work out why that is, because the goal of this modality is to try and get your baby breathing spontaneously. So one of the causes for this is that you've set a mandatory minute volume that's too high. And if you do that, you're going to get hypocapnia, and that hypocapnia will actually send a feedback signal up to the respiratory center saying you don't need to breathe very much because you're getting more than enough ventilation already. So making sure you haven't set it too high is important. It can be two causes for that. You can have set your tidal volume too high, or you can set your respiratory rate too high. And in this instance, you can see I set a respiratory rate of 60, and that has ablated all the spontaneous breathing out altogether. We've got tidal volumes of 6 mils per kilo. Just on that upper range, this is mini recruitment volume, but it's the respiratory rate that is too high in this particular instance. So if you don't have spontaneous breathing, it's really important to have a good look at your set tidal volume and your respiratory rate to see why that might be and whether they're contributing to it. However, there are other reasons that babies might stop breathing. And one of the more common ones that I might see is inspiratory times that are incorrectly set. So in this situation, we actually have an inspiratory time that's too long. You can see the inspiratory flow, peak flow coming down to zero flow. So this is when you've fully delivered your tidal volume, but you're keeping your pressure up and your tidal volume is kind of sitting there. So this is like an end inspiratory hold before you breathe out. Now, there's lots of reasons why this is not a good thing. I'm not going to go into them, but this prolonged hold activates stretch receptors and it inhibits that spontaneous rhythm generation in your respiratory center. So you're sending babies a signal that they shouldn't breathe on their own, and that's not really what we want to be doing. The opposite is that you might get very high spontaneous respiratory rates. So rather than an absence, you've got a baby who's kind of panting and breathing furiously away. And you don't want that because that baby is going to be using up a lot of energy with that very fast respiratory rate. So this respiratory rate in this instance was 92 per minute. So this could be because you've simply set a very low mandatory volume and that you've developed hypercarbia and the baby has got an intact respiratory center and is trying to furiously try to blow off that high CO2 that's a consequence of that low mandatory minute volume. It could also be that your baby has got hot because hypothermia can also result in a high spontaneous respiratory rate, and that can be difficult to control until the temperature is under control. But it may also be from inadequate pressure support, and this would probably be the more common scenario where you've got low spontaneous tidal volumes and therefore the infant's really trying to breathe more quickly to clear the waste gas from its lung. And you can see that sometimes clinically just simply because the baby is really working hard if you look at it and clearly not getting enough support for breathing. You might, on the other hand, have high tidal volumes, spontaneous tidal volumes, and that could happen as a result of too much pressure support. And that can be injurious to the lungs. So we don't want that. We're trying to protect these lungs. We want to keep those tidal volumes at the just right level. So usually that would happen if you've got a rapid improvement in lung condition, but your pressure support hasn't been decreased. So say after surfactant or after some kind of lung volume recruitment maneuver, where your volume guarantee with your mandatory component will make sure that baby is getting reduced peak inspiratory pressures for the mandatory component, but you, the clinician, is responsible for reducing this pressure support for the spontaneous breaths. And if you don't, then the baby will get overventilated. And then what happens is the spontaneous respiratory rate drops because the baby's getting these big spontaneous tidal volumes and it's therefore just simply doesn't have to breathe as often to avoid the hypoxia. So just to summarize, this is a modality that can be used across the full spectrum mechanical support for an intubated infant. You get automated weaning of mandatory breaths, and that means you're getting early development of autonomous respiratory patterns and likely resulting in earlier extubation. That's got to be a good thing. Seamless apnea ventilation, potentially really highly beneficial for the preterm infant with periodic breathing. You're going to get better cardiorespiratory stability, and that might be reflected in less brain injury if you've got more stable cerebral blood flows, for example. And you're going to get avoidance or reduced severity of any intermittent hypoxia that results from that periodic breathing. The goal with this modality is that the infant's going to seamlessly transition from mandatory to 100% spontaneous breathing, and doing that with lung protective tidal volumes at physiological rates so that the baby can divert calories and energy to growing rather than to breathing. You need, as the clinician, to pay close attention to your trends and the nature of the supported breaths, and that's how you can ensure that you're going to deliver this modality safely. But as always, lung volume recruitment remains really important.